The wind howled across the frozen wasteland, carrying ice crystals that stung like needles against exposed skin. In this bitter cold, at the edge of civilized space, a pale figure huddled against the lee of a snow-crusted boulder. Mara, her alabaster skin nearly invisible against the endless white, clutched a small bundle to her chest. Her tattered furs, once rich and warm, now hung in threadbare strips that offered little protection against the merciless elements. "Chalamet, Chalamet," she sang, her voice thin and wavering in the howling gale. "Kir nula Chalamet." The lullaby, an ancient song of her people, felt hollow now. A final comfort she could offer her dying child. The infant in her arms barely stirred, its once bright eyes clouded, its breaths shallow and irregular. Each exhale formed a wisp of vapor that dissipated more quickly than the last. Mara's four-fingered hand, cracked and bleeding from the cold, gently stroked the child's face. The infant's skin held a bluish tinge that had nothing to do with its natural coloration. 3 days they had wandered in this frozen hell after their transport crashed. 3 days of dwindling supplies and fading hope. "Kir nula Chalamet," she continued, her voice breaking as the infant's chest failed to rise for one terrible moment. Then a tiny gasp, and the shallow rhythm resumed. Tears froze on Mara's cheeks as she gazed upward at the twilight sky. The stars, cold and distant, offered no solace. Her people believed that souls returned to the stars when bodies failed, but not her child. Not yet. She would not accept it. The wind shifted suddenly, driving snow into her face. She turned away, hunching her shoulders to shield her baby from the worst of it. When she looked up again, squinting against the blinding white, she saw something impossible. Footprints, human footprints, appearing one by one in the virgin snow. Mara stiffened, instinctively drawing her child closer. Their ship had crashed in forbidden territory, the borderlands where humans claimed dominion. The stories her people told of humans were dark. Hunters, they said, who collected alien skulls as trophies and stripped the flesh from bones for sport. Yet, as the figure materialized through the swirling snow, Mara felt only a desperate, treacherous hope. Death by a human's weapon might be preferable to watching her child slowly freeze. The silhouette grew closer, a broad-shouldered form trudging with deliberate steps. Something glinted in its hand. A weapon. Perhaps. Mara's lullaby faltered, then died in her throat as her baby's breathing stalled again. "Kirnu," she whispered, shaking the bundle gently. "Please, little one." The human was less than 20 paces away now, close enough that Mara could see the frost-rimmed goggles and the vapor of breath emerging from a mask-covered face. Close enough to see that what glinted in the human's hand was not a weapon, but some kind of instrument. A scanner, perhaps. The figure stopped, regarding her for a long moment. Then, with slow, deliberate movements, it removed its goggles, revealing eyes of startling clarity, the color of the summer sky that Mara had not seen in months of flight. "You're hurt," the human said, its voice rough but not unkind. "Your child?" The language was strange to Mara's ears, but she had learned enough of the human tongue during her time as a refugee to understand the question. She nodded mutely, uncertain if she was sealing their fate. The human approached cautiously, kneeling at a respectful distance. He, Mara realized, recognizing the deeper timbre of a male voice, unshouldered a pack and withdrew something that emitted a soft red glow. "Heat pack," he explained, extending it toward her. "For the little one." Mara hissed, pulling back. It could be a trap, a lure to bring her close enough for killing. The human didn't press. Instead, he placed the heat pack on the snow between them, then withdrew more items from his pack, a container that steamed when opened, strips of what appeared to be dried meat, a blanket far thicker than Mara's tattered coverings. "Davis," he said, tapping his chest. My name is Davis. Mara remained silent, but her eyes darted to the heat pack. Her baby's breath rattled, growing fainter. Davis nodded toward a barely visible structure in the distance. Shelter, he said. I have a cabin, not far. He stood, moving slowly, as if afraid to startle her, and began clearing snow in a path toward the distant building. Every few steps, he glanced back, making sure she watched. Mara looked down at her child, whose lips had taken on the gray pallor that preceded death among her kind. The heat pack glowed invitingly on the snow. With trembling fingers, she reached for it, ready to snatch her hand back at the first sign of danger. The pack was gloriously, wonderfully warm. She pressed it against her child's chest, and in response, the infant's eyes fluttered. A tiny hand, so like her own with its 4 delicate fingers, grasped weakly at the fabric of her garment. That small movement decided her, clutching her baby and the precious heat source. Mara rose on unsteady legs and began to follow Davis's footprints toward the promise of shelter. The cabin loomed before them, a simple structure of reinforced polymer and salvaged metal that stood as a defiant testament to human stubbornness against the unforgiving environment. Davis had reached it minutes ahead of Mara, and she now watched warily as he cleared snow from the entrance with broad sweeps of his arm. Each step toward the human dwelling felt like betrayal of everything her people had taught her. Humans were the enemy, the reason her kind had been driven to the outer reaches of habitable space, the reason she had been fleeing with her child when their ship malfunctioned. Yet the weight of her baby, responding already to the heat pack with stronger movements, anchored her resolve. Davis pushed open the door, stomping his boots on the threshold. "Come," he called, gesturing inside. Mara hesitated at the perimeter. The human dwelling smelled of unfamiliar things: combustible fuel, cured animal hides, preserved foods with sharp, alien spices. Davis disappeared inside, and for a moment, Mara considered turning back. But to what? The endless snow offered only a beautiful death. Steeling herself, she crossed the threshold. Warmth enveloped her immediately, not the harsh, artificial heat of spacecraft, but something deeper and more primal. A fire crackled in a metal stove at the center of the single room. Furs and blankets were piled on a simple frame bed in one corner. Shelves lined with supplies occupied another wall, while tools and what appeared to be hunting implements hung on another. Davis had removed his outer garments, revealing a weathered face with several days' growth of beard. His body was solid, powerful, built for survival in this harsh place. He moved with the efficient confidence of a predator, yet his eyes held something Mara had not expected: concern. "Sit," he said, indicating a chair near the stove. "Warm first." When Mara remained standing, clutching her child defensively, Davis shrugged and turned his attention to a pot he placed on the stove. Soon, a rich aroma filled the cabin, some kind of broth, hearty and nourishing. The infant squirmed in Mara's arms, responding to the warmth of the room. Its eyes, clouded just an hour ago, now showed flickers of awareness. Tiny, four-fingered hands reached upward, grasping at the air. Davis glanced over, something like a smile crossing his face. "Strong kid," he said. "Fighters survive out here." Mara found her voice at last. "Why?" she asked, the human word awkward on her tongue. "Why help?" Davis ladled broth into a bowl. "Starving mother, dying kid, blizzard coming," he said, as if these simple facts explained everything. He offered the bowl to her. "Drink, then we talk." The broth was strange but not unpleasant, salty, and rich with nutrients Mara hadn't consumed in weeks of desperate flight. She drank in careful sips, mindful of her weakened state, using her free hand while cradling her baby in the other arm. As warmth spread through her body, she became more aware of her surroundings. The cabin was Spartan, but meticulously organized. Tools for survival, not comfort. Davis moved around the space with practiced efficiency, hanging his outer garments to dry, checking supplies, adjusting the fire in the stove. "Your child needs food," he said after a while, approaching with a small container. "This is simplified, protein base. I use it when hunting extends too long." Mara sniffed the paste he offered. It seemed safe enough. Nothing her people couldn't metabolize. With hesitant fingers, she scooped a small amount and touched it to her baby's lips. The infant's tongue darted out, tasting. Then lips worked hungrily. "Good," Davis said, nodding with satisfaction. "More broth for you, then rest." As Mara fed her child and herself, she studied Davis covertly. He was not what the stories had led her to expect. There was no brutality in his movements, no hunger for violence in his eyes. He was simply surviving. Like her. Night deepened outside, the wind's howl intensifying. Davis added fuel to the stove and arranged blankets on the floor beside it. "You take the bed," he said, gesturing. "Warmer for the little one." Mara shook her head. She would not sleep vulnerable while a human watched. Davis seemed to understand. Without comment, he retreated to the bed himself, settling on top of the covers, his back to the wall, a clear line of sight to the door. He kept a projectile weapon within reach, not aimed at her, but ready. They regarded each other across the room, hunter and hunted, predator and prey. Or perhaps, Mara thought with sudden clarity, just two souls caught in the same merciless storm. The infant stirred against her chest, making a soft cooing sound that Mara hadn't heard in days. A sound of contentment, of safety. Outside, the blizzard raged, but within the cabin's walls, an uneasy truce held through the long night. Dawn arrived without sunlight, only a subtle lightening of the perpetual gray beyond the cabin's single window. Mara awoke with a start, disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings. She had not meant to sleep, had fought against exhaustion for hours while watching the humans still form on the bed. Yet sometime in the night, her body had surrendered to the warmth and relative safety. Her baby stirred against her chest, and panic seized her until she felt the strong, steady breathing. The infant's color had improved dramatically overnight, the bluish tinge replaced by the natural pearlescent sheen of their kind. Tiny eyelids fluttered open, revealing irises of swirling silver that fixed on Mara's face with recognition. "Mela," she whispered, using the endearment that meant my star. A sound from across the room snapped her attention upward. Davis was already awake, moving quietly about his morning routine. He had stoked the fire in the stove and appeared to be inventorying supplies from a storage container. "Storm's worse," he said without looking up. 2, maybe 3 days before breaking. Mara's grip tightened on her child. 3 days trapped with a human. 3 days of vulnerability, of depending on his continued mercy. Davis approached, carrying another bowl of broth and more of the protein paste. "Eat," he said simply, setting both on a small table near her. As Mara fed her strengthening child, Davis pulled a device from among his gear, a slim metal rod with a glowing display. He frowned at whatever it showed him, then moved to the window, holding it up against the glass. "What is that?" Mara asked, surprising herself with the question. Davis glanced back. "Tracker," he replied. "Monitors movement, heat signatures." "You track what? Animals?" "Sometimes." His eyes met hers. "Sometimes things hunting me." A chill that had nothing to do with the temperature ran through Mara. "Hunting you? Why would someone hunt a human here?" Davis's face hardened. "I ask too many questions. See things I shouldn't. The company doesn't like witnesses." "Company?" "Extraction Corporation. They mine the eastern ridges, leave nothing behind but poison and bones." He tapped the tracker. "Been hiding 3 years. Longer than most who crossed them. Understanding dawned on Mara. This human was also a fugitive, an outcast, perhaps not so different from herself. The realization didn't entirely dissolve her wariness, but it recontextualized their uneasy alliance. Davis continued monitoring the tracker, his posture growing more tense. Finally, he spoke without turning. "Your ship, when it crashed, did you send a distress signal?" "No," Mara answered. "Communication systems failed first. That's why we—" She trailed off, unwilling to explain the full circumstances of their flight. "Good," Davis muttered. "Better if they think you're dead." "Who?" "Everyone." His eyes met hers again, and this time she saw something new there. Not just the wariness of a survivor, but the haunted look of someone who had seen too much death. "This planet isn't kind to those who don't belong." The tracker in his hand suddenly emitted a soft ping. Davis stiffened, moving swiftly to another window. "What is it?" Mara asked, instinctively drawing her child closer. "Signal. Mechanical. About 10 kilometers east." He adjusted something on the device, his expression growing grimmer. "Moving this way." "Hunters?" Davis nodded. "Company enforcers? Maybe. Or scavengers looking for salvage from your crash." He tucked the tracker into his belt and began gathering equipment, weapons, medical supplies, food concentrates. "We need to prepare." "Prepare for what?" "To fight. Or run." He tossed her a thick winter garment. "Your choice, but decide quickly." Mara looked down at her child, now alert and significantly stronger than yesterday, but still fragile. Running in the blizzard would be a death sentence for the infant. Yet staying meant trusting this human completely with their lives. "I cannot run with my child in this storm," she said finally. Davis nodded, continuing his preparations. "Then we make a stand. If they're just scavengers, they might pass by. If they're company—" He checked the magazine on a wicked-looking rifle. "Well, 2 more bodies in the snow won't bother them." As Davis arranged weapons and set simple traps around the cabin's perimeter, Mara found herself watching his methodical movements with a growing sense of respect. There was nothing wasted in his actions, nothing superfluous. He was a creature perfectly adapted to survival in this harsh frontier. "Can you use this?" he asked, offering her a long blade with a serrated edge. Mara hesitated only briefly before taking it. The weight felt good in her hand, familiar, even. Before becoming a refugee, she had trained as a temple guardian on her homeworld, though those skills had seemed useless during months of hiding and flight. "Yes," she said simply. Davis raised an eyebrow but didn't question her. Instead, he showed her defensive positions within the cabin, places where she could take cover with the child if shooting started. As twilight approached, the pinging of the tracker grew more frequent. Whatever approached was now within 5 kilometers and moving steadily despite the storm. Davis positioned himself by a window, rifle ready. Mara sat in a protected corner, her child secured in a makeshift sling across her chest, the blade balanced in her right hand. The infant, sensing the tension, remained quiet, silver eyes wide and watching. "They'll come from the east," Davis said, his voice low. 2, maybe 3, based on the signature spread. "Wait for my signal before you move." Mara nodded, though a part of her wondered why she was placing such trust in this human. Yesterday, she had believed his kind were monsters. Today, she prepared to fight alongside one. The minutes stretched into an hour. The only sounds were the howling wind, the occasional crack of the stove, and the increasingly urgent pinging of the tracker. Davis remained utterly still at his position, a predator waiting for prey. Finally, he spoke without turning. 300 meters. Moving slower now. They've spotted the cabin. Mara's grip tightened on her blade. "What will they do?" "Depends who they are. Scavengers might call out. Try to negotiate shelter. Company enforcers. His voice hardened. They shoot first. The tracker emitted a new sound, a sustained tone rather than intermittent pings. Davis tensed. They've stopped moving. He adjusted his rifle. About 200 meters out. Assessing. Mara rose to a crouch, ready to move. Her child made a small sound, and she whispered soothing words in her native tongue. A new sound cut through the howling wind, a mechanical whirring, growing louder. Down! Davis shouted, diving away from the window an instant before it shattered in a hail of gunfire. Bullets tore through the cabin wall, splintering wood and ricocheting off metal surfaces. Mara flattened herself against the floor, covering her child with her body. The assault lasted seconds, but felt like an eternity. When it ceased, Davis was already in a new position, rifle aimed through a firing port he'd prepared earlier. He squeezed off 3 precise shots, then ducked as return fire tore into the cabin. 2 humans in combat gear, he called to her. And something bigger, a mech unit. I think. Mara knew what that meant. Mechanical combat units were the company's favorite enforcers. Relentless, emotionless, and virtually unstoppable with conventional weapons. The cabin walls shuddered as something heavy approached. Metal footsteps crunched in the snow outside. They're going to breach the east wall, Davis said, retrieving something from his pack, a cylindrical device with a blinking light. When they do, I'll draw their fire. You go out the back, into the storage cellar. Tunnel leads to a cave system about half a kilometer south. You want us to run? Mara asked, surprised by his sudden change in strategy. Want you to live, Davis replied, not meeting her eyes. Which won't happen if you stay. Before Mara could respond, the east wall exploded inward in a shower of splinters and metal fragments. Through the swirling snow and smoke, 2 armored figures charged in, weapons blazing. Behind them loomed a larger silhouette, the mech unit, its sensor array glowing red in the gloom. Davis hurled the cylindrical device toward the intruders, then laid down covering fire from his position. The device detonated with a flash that temporarily blinded the attackers, giving Davis seconds to change position. Mara should have run then, should have taken her child and escaped through the back exit as Davis had instructed. Instead, she felt something ancient and powerful surge through her body. The Temple Guardian training, dormant for so long, awakened with crystalline clarity. With her child secured tightly against her chest, she moved with fluid grace toward the nearest attacker. The human in armor was still disoriented from the flash, firing wildly at where Davis had been. He never saw Mara approach until her blade found the seam between helmet and chest plate. Blood spurted, red, just like her own, as the attacker collapsed. Mara was already moving toward the second human, who had spotted Davis and was preparing to fire. Down! She shouted to Davis, who dropped instantly. The attacker, confused by the new voice, hesitated a crucial second before swinging their weapon toward Mara. It was enough. She ducked under the barrel and thrust upward with her blade, finding another vulnerable seam in the armor. The second attacker fell, but there was no time for relief. The mech unit, processing the elimination of its human counterparts, pivoted its weapons toward Mara and her child. Davis appeared suddenly from smoke and shadows, firing his rifle at the mech's sensors. The bullets pinged harmlessly off its armored shell, but the attack drew its attention. Mechanical limbs whirred as it recalibrated to this new threat. Run! Davis shouted to her. Now! Instead, Mara circled behind the mech, seeking a vulnerability she could exploit with her blade. The machine's back housing contained cooling vents, a potential weakness. She prepared to strike. The mech, registering threats from multiple directions, made a calculation. One metallic arm swung toward Davis, firing a barrage that forced him to dive for cover. The other arm reached into a compartment and withdrew a small, spherical object that it hurled toward Mara. Grenade! Davis yelled, his voice cutting through the chaos. Mara froze. the blade half raised, her child suddenly wailing at the noise and violence. The grenade arced through the air, a perfect trajectory toward mother and infant. Time seemed to slow. Mara saw her death approaching and could only clutch her child tighter, turning away in a futile attempt to shield the small body with her own. A shadow passed over her, Davis, launching himself into the grenade's path. He swept it aside with one arm, managing to deflect it toward the already damaged east wall. The explosion was deafening, sending debris and fire in all directions. Davis's body absorbed much of the blast that would have reached Mara and her child. He was thrown backward, landing heavily beside her, blood spreading across his thermal suit from multiple wounds. The mech advanced through the swirling smoke, weapons trained on the fallen human. Mara, still clutching her child, saw Davis's rifle lying within reach. Without conscious thought, she snatched it up, somehow knowing which lever was the trigger. The rifle bucked in her hands as she emptied the magazine into the mech's exposed cooling vents. For a moment, nothing happened. Then sparks erupted from the machine's joints. Its movements became erratic, sensor array flickering. With a high-pitched whine, it froze in place, caught in some internal feedback loop. Davis, despite his injuries, saw the opportunity. He pulled a final explosive device from his belt and hurled it with surprising accuracy, lodging it in the mech's partially damaged housing. "Cover!" he gasped, pulling Mara and her child behind an overturned metal table. The explosion that followed shook the entire cabin. When Mara dared to look, the mech was a smoking ruin, its limbs scattered in twisted heaps. Of the cabin's east wall, nothing remained but charred supports. Snow and wind poured in through the gaping hole, already beginning to douse the fires started by the grenades. Davis lay beside her, breathing heavily, one hand pressed to his side where blood seeped between his fingers. His face was ashen, but his eyes were clear as they found hers. "Nice shot," he managed, a ghost of a smile crossing his pain-tightened features. Mara stared at him, unable to comprehend why this human had placed himself between death and her child. A child not of his species, not of his blood. In that moment, everything she had been taught about humans seemed a hollow lie. She reached down and pulled a blanket from the debris, draping it over Davis's shivering form. It wasn't much, a small gesture of gratitude, but it was the first time she had willingly touched something meant for him. Their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them. Trust, perhaps, or the beginning of it. Outside, the blizzard continued its relentless assault, but within the ruined cabin, among blood and fire and twisted metal, a fragile bond had been forged. Dawn broke with unexpected clarity, the storm having exhausted itself sometime in the night. Sunlight streamed through the shattered eastern wall of the cabin, illuminating the destruction within: charred timbers, scattered supplies, the twisted remains of the mech unit. In the relatively intact western corner, Davis sat propped against a wall, methodically cleaning and binding his wounds. The grenade blast had peppered his left side with shrapnel, and a bullet had grazed his right shoulder. But none of the injuries appeared life-threatening. His movements were stiff but precise, those of a man accustomed to tending his own hurts. Across from him, Mara cradled her child, who nursed eagerly at her breast. The infant's transformation was remarkable, from gray-tinged and listless 2 days ago to vibrant and hungry now. Silver eyes, fully alert, darted curiously around the cabin between feedings. "Your little one's tough," Davis observed, tying off a bandage. "Good color now." Mara nodded, allowing herself the smallest smile. "He is stronger than I dared hope." She paused, then added softly, "Thank you." Davis shrugged, then winced at the movement. "Didn't do much. Just got you warm." "You did more," Mara said, her eyes dropping to his bandaged side. "Much more." An awkward silence fell between them, filled with unspoken questions. Finally, Davis cleared his throat. We need to move. Others will have heard the explosions, or picked up the mech's distress signal before it went dark. Move where? Mara asked. This place is... She gestured at the ruins of what had been their shelter. Can rebuild, Davis said, rising stiffly to his feet. But not here. I have another site. Abandoned mining outpost in the foothills. About 20 kilometers south. Mara looked doubtful. 20 kilometers in snow? With a child? With your injuries? Davis moved to the remains of his supply cache, salvaging what hadn't been destroyed in the battle. Have a transport sled cached 2 kilometers from here. Solar-powered. Gets us most of the way. Why would you do this? Mara asked. The question that had been burning in her mind since he first appeared in the blizzard. Take such risks for strangers? For my kind? Davis paused in his work, not meeting her eyes. Had a family once, he said after a long moment. Wife. Daughter. Before the company came to this world. His hands resumed their methodical sorting of supplies, but his voice had grown distant. Couldn't save them. Can maybe save you. The simple statement hung in the air between them, revealing more about this solitary human than hours of conversation might have. Mara found herself reassessing everything, her preconceptions, her fears, the stories she had been told. I am sorry, she said simply, knowing the inadequacy of the words. Davis nodded once, accepting the sentiment without comment. He continued preparations, gathering the essentials they would need for the journey ahead. By midday, they were ready. Davis had fashioned a carrier for the infant that would keep him warm against Mara's body while leaving her hands free. The salvage supplies had been packed efficiently, prioritizing medicine, food, and weapons. Storm's cleared, but won't last, Davis said, scanning the horizon. Need to move quickly. They left the ruined cabin behind, trudging through snow that reached mid-thigh in some drifts. Davis broke trail, using a salvaged piece of mech plating as a makeshift snow shovel. Despite his injuries, he maintained a steady pace, stopping periodically to check their bearings against a compass. Mara followed in his footsteps, her child warm and content in the carrier. The infant watched the crystalline world with fascination, occasionally reaching out to touch snowflakes that drifted down from overladen branches. They reached the cached transport sled by mid-afternoon, a sleek, practical vehicle with runners instead of wheels and a small cabin just large enough for 2 adults. Solar panels on its roof gleamed in the winter sunlight. Not pretty, but it moves, Davis said, brushing snow from the controls. Company prototype. Borrowed it when I left their employ. The sled hummed to life under his hands, power cells charged by the clear day's sunlight. Davis helped Mara and her child into the passenger compartment before taking the controls himself. They glided over the snow-covered landscape, following a route that kept them within the shadow of rocky outcroppings and stands of evergreen trees, natural cover against aerial observation. Davis handled the sled with the same quiet competence he brought to everything, navigating difficult terrain with minimal fuss. As twilight approached, the foothills loomed before them, dark silhouettes against the purpling sky. Davis guided the sled into a narrow ravine, then up a barely visible track that wound between towering stone formations. Almost there, he said, nodding toward a dark opening in the hillside ahead. Old emergency shaft. Company abandoned it years ago when the main vein played out. The entrance was concealed behind a stand of evergreens, invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. Davis guided the sled inside, powering down once they were safely under cover. The interior of the abandoned mine had been transformed. What had once been a utilitarian industrial space now showed signs of prolonged habitation. Portable lighting units cast a warm glow over the main chamber. A more permanent stove than the one in the cabin radiated heat. Sleeping pallets, storage containers, Even crude furniture fashioned from salvaged materials gave the space a surprisingly home-like feel. "My backup plan," Davis explained, helping Mara from the sled. "Been preparing it for a year, just in case." "It's impressive," Mara said, genuinely surprised by the extent of his preparations. Davis merely shrugged, already moving to organize their salvaged supplies and check the security systems he had installed around the perimeter. That night, they shared a meal of reconstituted protein and dried vegetation that Davis had cultivated in a small hydroponic setup deeper in the mine. The food was simple but nourishing, especially for Mara, whose body was still recovering from the ordeal of their journey. Her child, now fed and content, lay on a soft pallet beside her, exploring his surroundings with curious eyes. His tiny hands reached for the play of light and shadow on the rock ceiling, and for the first time in weeks, Mara heard him laugh, a burbling sound of pure joy that brought unexpected tears to her eyes. Davis, seated across the chamber, looked up at the sound. The hard lines of his face softened almost imperceptibly. "What's his name?" he asked, the first personal question he had ventured since their meeting. Mara hesitated. Names held power in her culture. To share a name was to extend trust. "Kieran," she said finally. "It means ray of light in the old tongue." Davis nodded, seeming to understand the significance of her sharing this information. "Good name. Strong." Kieran chose that moment to make another sound. Not quite a word, but more purposeful than his previous vocalizations. Both adults turned to look at him, the infant's silver eyes fixed on Davis with unexpected intensity. His mouth worked, forming shapes that seemed almost deliberate. "Ho!" The sound was barely audible, more breath than voice. "Ho! Mara froze, scarcely believing what she was hearing. Kieran was attempting speech, far earlier than children of her kind typically develop such skills. "What is he?" Kieran repeated, more clearly this time. His tiny hand reached toward Davis. "Home." The word hung in the air between them, simple, yet profound. Home. A concept Mara had abandoned hope of finding again when their ship crashed. A concept Davis had rebuilt for himself, out of the ruins of his previous life. And now, inexplicably, a word forming on the lips of an infant who should not yet be capable of speech. Davis seemed as startled as Mara, his usual stoicism momentarily replaced by genuine surprise. "Smart kid," he said finally, his voice rough with some emotion Mara couldn't identify. "Yes," she agreed, gathering Kieran into her arms. "Very smart." That night, Mara slept deeply for the first time in months, her child secure beside her. In her dreams, she saw not the horrors of their flight or the violence of recent days, but instead a strange, comforting vision of spring, of snow melting to reveal green shoots, of warmth returning to a frozen world. Winter yielded slowly to spring in the foothills. Snow retreated inch by stubborn inch, revealing the dormant landscape beneath. As the days lengthened and temperatures moderated, the abandoned mining outpost transformed from mere shelter to something approaching a home. Davis expanded the living space, salvaging materials from the damaged cabin and other abandoned structures scattered across the borderlands. His injuries healed, leaving new scars among the many that already marked his body. He shared little about his past, but each scar told a story of survival against harsh odds. Mara, for her part, contributed skills Davis lacked. Her people were known for their affinity with living things, and under her care, the small hydroponic garden flourished, diversifying their diet beyond preserved rations. She taught herself to hunt using Davis's weapons, bringing down small game that supplemented their meals. In quiet evenings, she sang songs of her homeworld, no longer desperate lullabies for a dying child, but teaching melodies filled with the history and wisdom of her people. And Kieran, thrived beyond all expectation. The infant grew with remarkable speed, his silver eyes taking in everything with precocious intelligence. He began forming words in both human and alien tongues, creating his own hybrid language that his mother and Davis came to understand. His first steps were taken on a rare warm day, when Davis had carried him outside to feel sunshine on his face. They lived in cautious isolation, Davis maintaining an elaborate security perimeter that would warn of any approach. But as weeks passed without incident, their vigilance gradually relaxed. The company, it seemed, had either lost interest in tracking Davis or assumed he had perished in the explosion that destroyed the cabin. One bright morning, Davis returned from checking snares with a spring in his step that Mara had never seen before. "Snow's clear all the way to the eastern ridge," he announced, shrugging off his lighter-weight jacket. "Could start repairs on the main habitat module today." The module he referred to was a more permanent structure they had been planning, a proper home built into the hillside, with windows positioned to catch the sunlight and spaces designed for living rather than merely surviving. "Good," Mara replied, looking up from where she sat with Kieran, teaching him to weave simple patterns with dried grasses. "Kieran grows tired of stone walls. I think—" "Outside!" Kieran declared, abandoning his weaving to toddle toward Davis with outstretched arms. "Go outside with Fa." Davis still hesitated momentarily whenever Kieran used that term. Fa, short for father, a role he had never sought, but somehow acquired in the child's eyes. After a moment, he scooped the boy up with a gentleness that belied his rough exterior. "Outside soon, little scout," he promised, "when we finish your mother's roof." Mara watched the interaction with a familiar warmth spreading through her chest. It had been strange at first, seeing her child form such an attachment to a human. Stranger still to recognize her own changing feelings toward Davis. Where once she had seen an alien predator, she now saw simply a man, complex, damaged by his past, yet capable of profound kindness. They worked together through the day, Davis handling the heavy construction, while Mara applied her more delicate touch to the finishing elements. Kieran helped in his way, solemnly carrying small tools from one adult to the other, practicing new words, investigating everything with tireless curiosity. As sunset painted the western sky in shades of amber and rose, they stood back to admire their progress. The framework of the habitat module was complete, lacking only the transparent panels that would form its windows and the final ceiling of its roof. "Another week, maybe less," Davis estimated, wiping sweat from his brow. "Then we can move in properly." "It's beautiful," Mara said, and meant it. The structure incorporated elements from both their cultures. The practical efficiency of human design melded with the organic flow favored by her people. "I never thought—" She trailed off, unwilling to complete the thought aloud, that she never imagined building a new home after everything she had lost. Davis seemed to understand anyway. He nodded once, his eyes meeting hers with that peculiar intensity that always made her heart beat faster. "Time to eat," he said, breaking the moment. "Kieran's hungry, I bet." "Hungy," the child agreed enthusiastically, tugging at Davis's pant leg. "Fa hungy too." They shared a simple meal as twilight deepened into night. Kieran, exhausted from his day of helping, fell asleep almost immediately afterward, curled in a nest of soft furs that Davis had prepared especially for him. In the quiet that followed, Mara and Davis sat beside the small fire outside their temporary shelter, watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. These moments of companionable silence had become precious to Mara, times when the barriers between their different species seemed to dissolve, leaving just two souls sharing the same moment of peace. "I've been thinking," Davis said finally, his voice low so as not to wake Kieran. "When the habitat is finished, you both could stay, if you wanted." The words hung in the air between them, not a command or even a request, but an offering, a choice. Mara looked up at the stars, the same stars her people believed held the souls of their ancestors. Somewhere among them was her homeworld, now lost to her. Somewhere among them were all the places she had fled, seeking safety for her child. "My people have a ritual," she said after a long moment. "When one chooses to bind their fate to another's, it isn't marriage, as humans understand it. It's deeper. A recognition that souls have found their proper orbit around each other." Davis turned to look at her, his expression unreadable in the firelight. "In this ritual," Mara continued, "the one who chooses takes a new name, not abandoning the old, but adding to it, acknowledging that they have become something new through the connection." She met his gaze steadily. "I would like to be called Arla now," she said. "It means one who has found shelter after long journey." Understanding dawned in Davis's eyes, recognition of what she was truly saying. His hand moved across the space between them, hesitant, as if expecting her to pull away. When she didn't, his fingers found hers, rough calluses against smooth skin. "Arla," he said, testing the name. "It's beautiful." They sat together as night deepened, hands joined, watching the stars wheel overhead. No further words were needed. Their choice had been made, not in a single moment, but in 1,000 small moments of trust and kindness over the months since their first meeting in the snow. Inside the shelter, Kieran stirred in his sleep, murmuring something that sounded like home before settling again. The child who had almost died in a blizzard now slept secure, protected by two beings from different worlds who had somehow built a family out of compassion and shared survival. Morning would bring another day of building, of planning, of watching the horizon for threats that might someday return. But for now, in this moment between winter's end and summer's promise, Arla allowed herself to believe in the possibility of permanence, in a home built not of blood ties, but of chosen bonds, stronger for having been forged in hardship and cemented in love. As the fire burned down to embers, Davis, her human, her partner, her child's Fa, squeezed her hand gently. Together, they watched a meteor trace a brilliant path across the night sky. Not an ending, Arla thought, but a beginning. A new star being born from fire and ice, just as their family had been. "Home," she whispered, and felt the words settle into her heart like a seed taking root in once frozen ground. "We are home,"